Boa tarde a todas e todos aqui presentes e os que nos acompanham no YouTube.
Good afternoon, everyone, ladies and gentlemen, those who are here on site and remotely. FIB is an event which aims to collaborate to a number of multi-stakeholder endeavors. We hope this is going to be a very significant time that everyone will remember all over the country. Before I hand over to our moderators to officially open our first session, I would like to say that your participation will be key whenever we have a Q&A session. Those who are here at the premises in Salvador, the state of Bahia, you please find your microphones, you line up to ask your questions. If you are following us remotely, you may send your questions via YouTube chat, so your questions may be addressed. Don't refrain from following us at our social media and communicate this event with our hashtag FIB15. You may find us in all social medias, Telegram, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, and now you are all mostly welcome. And I'd like to hand over to the moderator of our first session. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, those who are here in Salvador City and those who couldn't make and are following us online. I am director of CGI and also am coordinator of the platform task force. This is a wonderful opportunity. We had already scheduled a session to talk about future regulatory consensus and principles to regulate social media platforms. And within the CGI, we have just concluded a letter, a 10 principles letter about our way to participate and to disclose our tasks in social medias. And here we are to talk about consensus, how to regulate social media. And also our goal here today is to introduce you the 10 principles letter, which will go under a public hearing today until June 16. So this is, a hot topic because this is a novelty and it is a result of a number of work that our regulatory working group is following. We started our first seminars and workshops back in 2021. Then we had a very broad public hearing about platform coverage and to address a number of regulatory aspects such as services, economic regulation, who should be in charge of institutional regulatory aspects. That was a bulk work which we did last year. And more recently, we offered a workshop in Brasília about network applications in a way to help to foster this discussion about the involvement of Article 19 in our Constitution and a number of discussions in the Congress House about how to regulate and find the best use of social medias. This is a long-lasting debate, and it has been through the National Congress a couple of times, and now there is this new bill which has been produced by the executive level to take that discussion further into the Supreme Court as well as in the Congress House. CGI, though, understands that this is a discussion which still has to keep going. And we here, I hope that we might leave the premises of by the end of the week and hasten this discussion. Regarding methodology, our consultation 2 years ago had covered a number of principles, but today our main emphasis is on one type of application, which is social media. We are not here to talk about search mechanisms, nor marketplace, neither economic regulation. Despite all these topics being very relevant, I understand, but this week we'll be emphasizing, or actually today, we'll be emphasizing social media and how we can better regulate this segment, this layer of our society.
Então, o que a gente fez, né, nessa discussão que terminou aí na última sexta-feira.
So, as I said, we closed this discussion last Friday during our CGI.br meeting, where we tried to reach some consensus which will support our future guidelines. After this 3 weeks consultation or public hearing, we are going to get to an internal discussion within CGI that will write down a number of guidelines, which will be our next step to collaborate about this hot topic. I would like to thank the participation of my panelists, Fabiana, Sergio Alves, and Rachel Saraiva. But we are also going to count on Joan Brandt's presentations, who couldn't make on site, but he has joined us remotely.
O futuro comendador, o já comendador
João is a future commander. And João, please, I hand over to you right now.
Nós conseguimos fazer decálogo, novo decálogo.
So we managed to have a new decalogue, a new 10 principles.
Eu vou mostrar aqui na tela quais são
and what are the different types of principles? The panelists got yesterday these documents, so you can help us with your comments about the Decalogue.
Eu não sei se pode mostrar na tela aqui os princípios, gente.
Can you please share the principles?
Tá. Então, vou falar sobre os nossos princípios. Deveria estar passando, certo? Para lá? Tá. Então, os princípios de regulação de redes sociais.
Social media 10 principles. I will briefly cover some of them.
Algumas dos pontos importantes. Nesse primeiro, que trata de soberania e segurança
nacional. The first one about national safety and sovereignty. Here we are mainly addressing the importance of obey and legal order and other issues related to the right of democracy, as well as promoting diversities.
O segundo, então vai estar falando da questão da
we are going to be talking about the importance of freedom of expression and other rights, emphasizing the total protection to children and adolescents. Third, autodetermination, informational self-determination, which guarantees users' rights to decide which personal information and how personal information should be empowered by the social media. 4, information integrity, where we point out both to promote accuracy and content reliability, as well as memory preservation policies and how to defeat fraud and disinformation. 5th, We are talking about social development and innovation, and that the regulation should promote both the advancement of social network for economic development, as well as new ways to make business which are not based on mercantile activities. 6, we have a transparency and account management.
Do posicionamento de conteúdos quanto da monetização.
Content positioning, monetary aspects. 7, we understand that there is a need for interoperability, open standards, and greater access to our platforms by our users. 8, individual efforts to prevent any possible damage that may be a consequence of social activities. 9, regulatory balance, where we have to manage our regulatory actions, preserving and involving each one of the players. And last but not least, a regulatory environmental approach and a multi-stakeholder governance. And independent technical agencies which will have their own autonomy to pursue and implement all these measures. These are the 10 principles we have widely invested on a multi-stakeholder involvement, as well as the terminology. We try to use a straightforward language with no ambiguity, without repeating ourselves, being really straightforward, clear, transparent, and we hope that during the public consultation, we'll be able to prioritize the terminology. So during the public hearing, help us with the terminology, because our main goal is to have a very concise, transparent, and straightforward language. Well, that's it. These are the 10 principles. Now I'm going to hand over to João Brandt. Each one of us will have 20 minutes. Then we can open for a discussion panel. Thank you, João.
Obrigado, Henrique. Obrigado
pelo convite. Thanks for the invitation. I feel so honored. It's a pleasure to be here. Unfortunately, I couldn't make. I even had my airplane tickets to spend 2 days in Bahia, Salvador, with all of you. But this morning, I had something else to do at our Congress, and I couldn't leave Itamaraty's house. Once the ministers, they got together last week and they reached some final conclusions about digital services conclusions, as well as competition into a digital market. And I was caught here in our federal capital. Let me first greet CGI for the design of this decalogue. Those 10 principles are key, and I'm sure that they will support everything that the federal level is expecting from this endeavor. We have a number of challenges, which is to balance our regulatory framework, which should be an efficient one. One of the obstacles that we have on this international debate is to know how to surround all the negative externalities of a digital platform business model. I like saying that this is a model based on the maximization of users' engagement, which can be deleterious to the public debate, and it puts us many years backwards in order to regulate our informational environment. My perspective is from a democratic and a communicative perspective, freedom of expression, and in the past 10 days, we had to enhance information reliability and the discussion upon this topic of reliability, which now is more robust thanks to the UN proposal about information integrity as a whole, which becomes very challenging because it cannot be a safeguard to authoritarianism or any other interventions that will restrain freedom of expression or that will set parameters which are not those that will promote information access on behalf of our citizens. With all of that in mind, we are advocating for that nationally and internationally. This is a very important debate which involves a number of different interests and the accusation that we sometimes see in the public debate, which are covering public interests. And I hope that Brazil will be very efficient in this discussion. Brazilian citizens, they believe that platforms should rely on greater responsibility, take into account the content it is disclosed. 60% of Brazilians are in favor of regulating the platforms, and this percentage is much higher than those who are against or those who do not approve governmental efforts, regardless or despite political involvement or political desires. There is a full support into the regulation of social platforms, thanks to a number of factors. First, because we see systematically the violating rights for children and adolescents or the expansion of the disseminations of frauds. I recommend you to read an article which was published in the Wall Street Journal last week, addressing this issue, which is not just a Brazilian problem, but a global one. And unfortunately, we don't see any improvements as how platforms will answer to this fraud and cope. There are platforms which are more involved to public interests, others not so much, but I would say that in average, we don't see an increase in data protection. Despite we hear even some CEOs saying that there is a backlash as to some guarantees which were granted during the development of digital platforms. So we can no longer postpone such a relevant discussion. The Congress was working on that, and they still believe that the National Congress is the one that should reach balanced decisions, but it still believes that there is a need for a certain push-up.
Justamente o serviço que promove intermediação.
Services like that, they require intermediates to regulate third-party services, and also we want to see more institutional involvement to expand competition into this digital environment. We understand that it's possible to develop and to advance based on the Brazilian background of defeating for competition and to go forward towards more similar conditions which will avoid the dominance of larger groups which are dominant in our digital setting.
Elementos que poderiam estar no começo da minha fala, mas que eu acho que são relevantes sobre a dimensão.
In addition, let me add artificial intelligence and international admission.
tão rápido
Such
das
a
soluções de
fast
inteligência
growth
artificial,
of
a ampla
artificial
adoção dessas
intelligence
soluções
solutions, a
por
broad
empresas e por
adoption by
indivíduos,
companies and
a
by
capacidade de que a
subjects,
gente
the
vai precisar
ability
ter
that
muito brevemente
we will
de
need
buscar
to
respostas justamente
pursue,
para
which is to
proteger
go
direitos
after
sem
answers to
atrapalhar a
protect
competitividade e
our rights
inovação,
without
faz com que
impairing
esses debates tenham
competition,
que ser
neither
feitos
innovation.
em
With
diálogo.
that, the
Isso não
debate has
significa
to
que
be
eles
done based
são
on a
misturados. Eu
dialogue
acho que as
format.
que estão postas hoje no Congresso Nacional têm características específicas que
Each
permitem que eles
one
sejam
of
feitos
the
em trilhas
agendas, they have
específicas,
their
mas é
specific
preciso olhar e dialogar
characteristics
o tempo
and they
inteiro sobre
have
esses
to be
processos,
discussed
né? A
upon
gente está
their
vendo,
own
por exemplo,
trace.
empresas de
There
a
are
OpenAI que
companies such as
veio a público
OpenAI,
conhecida já
which
por um sistema de
became
IA generativo,
public by
ChatGPT,
a
já
stamp
discutindo a
of
possibilidade de trabalhar
generative
sistema de
AI,
open
which
feed.
is
Nós sabemos que as
ChatGPT,
empresas que
working on a feed
trabalham redes
model. We
sociais
know
de
that
maneira mais
companies who work
robusta
social networks in a
são
more
baseadas em
robust
inteligência artificial
manner,
e eles
this is
estão olhando
based
para
on
sistemas que
AI,
entregam
and
conteúdo
they want to see systems
mastigado
that
já para os
will
seus usuários, e
deliver
isso
a
coloca desafios também de ordem
ready-to-use content.
econômica. Se a gente olhar
All of that
competição
may
das
add some
indústrias
economic
de criação ou de bens
issues.
intangíveis, para citar algumas,
Intangible goods
música,
such as music,
audiovisual, design,
audiovisual,
jornalismo,
design,
e própria
journalism,
produção científica,
and
tudo isso está muito
scientific production,
impactado
all of those
pela
are
inteligência
highly
artificial e não
impacted
só
by
positivamente
AI, and
impactado.
not
Em
only
grande parte,
positively,
ao
but
absorver
also
publicidade e tráfego
the
daqueles que
absorption of
investem mais recursos na
publicity
criação,
and traffic
isso
of those
também
who
afeta
invest more resources
diretamente
in their
o
creation will
resultado
also affect
econômico dessas
directly
empresas e,
the
portanto, há um risco de
economic
você matar as
result
galinhas
of these
dos ovos de
companies,
ouro.
and there is a risk of
Por fim, as
losing
questões
the best
internacionais.
part
Eu
of
acho
the
que o
cake.
Brasil se posicionou muito bem
And finally,
nos últimos 2
Brazil
anos
is
no
really
cenário
well
internacional
positioned in
pelo
the
conjunto de
international
atores que
scenario
fazem este
in the
trabalho,
past
né?
2
Não é
years,
trabalho
thanks to a
só
number
do
of
governo.
players
Eu
who
sou
are
presidente de
involved.
de
And this is
público que
not
tem ampla
just
atuação
a
internacional. O CGI
governmental
lidera
involvement. We
a
have
atuação, ou diria,
other
a presença do
actors
Brasil, por exemplo, em
and
fóruns de
players
governança na
which
internet.
are in the
E eu acho que a
leadership
gente
of
precisa
internet governance
conseguir
forums.
avançar nos pontos em que
And
estão
our
hoje
goal is to
descobertos,
improve
mantendo
our
o que
gaps
a gente conseguiu de conquistar até hoje,
and keeping
sem
everything
perdas
that we had achieved
significativas. O que
so
eu estou querendo
far
dizer?
without
Nós
any
precisamos olhar
significant
para o ambiente
losses.
de
What
discussão
do I mean?
multissetorial em
Well, we
que
have to understand this
representado pelo
multi-stakeholder
IGF, né, e
involvement,
pela
which is
agenda
being
do
represented
IGF.
by the
Eu acho que o Brasil deu uma
IGF and
contribuição
its
muito grande do
agenda.
CGI com o NEC
Brazil
Mundial
has
mais 10,
collaborated
né, que a gente
greatly with the
aprimora a
Net
dimensão do
Mundial Plus 10,
setorialismo e, ao mesmo tempo,
and at the
fortaleceu o
same time,
multilateralismo.
it has
E acho
strengthened
que
the
o Pacto Digital
multi-sectorial
Global ele
approach.
estabeleceu as
The
balizas
global
para avançar
agreement
nessa agenda nos
has
próximos
set
10 anos. São balizas
pillars to
positivas, são
help us to
consensos
advance
positivos, há
in
uma
this
agenda
agenda for the
larga
coming
sobre a
years.
mesa que
There
passa pela
is
questão da
a
economia de
very
dados, passa pela
comprehensive
questão da
agenda
inteligência artificial,
addressing data
passa por temas
economy,
novos como sociedade da
AI,
informação
and
e por
new
temas mais
topics
clássicos,
such as
como as questões de
information,
conectividade, mas agora
security,
atualizada no momento
connectivity,
em que o
and
Brasil
all
ajudou
of
a impulsionar
that
no G20, que é a dimensão
updated
da
into
conectividade
our Brazilian
significativa. Então,
dimension,
isso aqui é
thanks
para
to
dar só um
G20,
panorama de dizer que eu acho
which
que os
is
desafios que a gente tem,
relevant
eles se dão no âmbito
connectivity
doméstico, mas eles
or
estão para conectar
meaningful
as com a ação
connectivity, better
internacional,
saying.
de forma a conseguir combinar
Our goal
esse
is
debate que
to
vem sendo feito sobre
match
como é que a gente promove a democracia, como é que a
how
gente
can we
promove
promote
espaços de
democracy,
enfrentamento
how
ao
can we
poder econômico, ao
promote
poder
a
político
way to face
desequilibrado,
a
e as
unbalanced
respostas precisam ser
political
justamente na
power,
combinação
and responses they should
dessas
be
ações
set just
internacionais e nacionais.
in a way
Acho que é
where
isso
we
que eu queria
match
deixar
both
aqui de
national
contribuição.
and
Agradecer mais uma
international
vez o convite,
endeavors.
lamentar
Well,
a
that's it from my
impossibilidade de
side. Once
comer um
again, I
acarajé
apologize
tardinho aí
for
com
not being
vocês,
with
mas
you
certeza de que a gente
and
terá oportunidade
have
nos próximos
delicious
dias.
baianas food, but
Obrigado,
I'll
João.
try to make
Espero que
next
você
time.
consiga. E parabéns.
Congratulations.
João, obrigado pela sua
João,
fala.
thank
Espero
you.
que você consiga ficar no
Thank
debate
you
aí
for
pra
your
gente
talk. I
poder
hope you can
fazer
stay for the
trocas aqui
debate so
daqui pra frente.
that we can
Não, quem
exchange
falha com a viagem
information.
reserva as 2 horas do debate completo, né, Henrique? Senão aí eu já
Well,
estava
yeah.
falhando demais.
I wouldn't be nice if I hadn't set aside the 2 hours for the debate, to include the debate. I'm going to put a QR code up on the screen for the consultation so you can access it and see the space to dialogue with that consultation in the next 3 weeks. Everybody knows him. He's the Secretary of Digital Products at SECOM. He's a PhD from the University of São Paulo. And let's move on to the next panelist, Raquel Sarabi. She's next to me from IBREC. She's the chair and founder of the Technology Institute of Recife and studied computer sciences and master in computer science from the Federal University of Pernambuco. Go ahead. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank NIC and CGI for the invitation to be a part of this session. Such an important thing of a heated topic, even in the public debate. I hope I can contribute towards this debate based on civil society perspectives. And I'd also like to congratulate NIC for holding the FIB. This is day 1. Actually, it's the second day, but it's already very interesting. I'd like to start off by saying that at a time when major digital platforms and the CEOs and owners of technology companies come up and expressly align their services with policies, parties, and people that are in line with the extreme rightist wing, we have a scenario where we can no longer use these services without specific regulation for that. Regulation is no longer an option, it's a need, it's a requirement. So that's what I will use as a starting point. We have to regulate digital platforms. And in that sense, I would first of all like to establish that the positions that I will demonstrate here are positions of the IPREC and also the group of people that are part of the Coalições da Rede and other groups of discussion that are more specific about regulating digital platforms, which obviously do not reflect all the positions of civil society, but is a part of the construct. And we do have a campaign, Internet Legal or Cool Internet, that includes other civil societies and others that are interested in regulating digital platforms. So I'd like to invite you to learn more about the campaign. So I'm just going to summarize some of the understandings that we've been converging in this long debate in regulating the platforms that's been heated up since 2020 with the proposal of the Bill 2030. So this regulation should come through the legislative power. If there are processes that are being judged right now, and 2 cases that reflect the need to discuss this topic. But the fundamental understanding is that regulation per se should be conducted by the legislative power, because at the end of the day, it's the area that has the power to do that and enables us to have higher social participation and civil society participating more. So the Bill of Law, PL 2630, includes all that. And the last information relating to the bill that were presented reflect all the discussions that have been taking place since 2020. And the last version of this bill should be the basis so we can resume these discussions and somehow advance in that purpose to regulate the digital platforms. But as the proposal of this session was to talk about principles, I was trying to summarize the understandings that we have in this subject matter into some principles. And I was very happy to see that most of them are somehow reflected in this document that was submitted by the CGI today. So somehow we are in great part on the path to converging the positioning. I'm also was very happy to see that João mentioned that the Bill of Law of the executive also reflects these principles, because we're also very anxious waiting on the text for that. FYI, João. So we haven't had access to anything, but we're anxiously waiting for that initiative of the government, and we believe that's very good. In terms of principles, and I'll start talking about protecting democracy and guaranteeing fundamental rights. So it has to have that, protecting human rights, freedom of speech, and especially non-discrimination, to guarantee a digital environment that will promote democratic values, that fights hate, discourse, lack of information, or aspects focused on social class, sexual orientation, and we believe, or gender, we believe that's essential, and we believe that the regulation should also include that. Second one would be transparency and accountability of the platforms, because they should have robust mechanisms and transparency, especially in content moderation practices, because we're talking about principles that were created for the regulation of social media, and also transparency regarding recommendations and the algorithms that are used for that. And that involves submitting periodical reports, data about moderation and boosting content, and clear policies about advertising and paid content that are on these platforms. The third one was the due process against abuse, in the sense that users have to have guaranteed right to clear information about content moderation when it affects users, as well as mechanism to have access in contesting those decisions and even remediation if the case. So that's essential to govern that. We have that in users' platforms, and that would be a way to mitigate, in my opinion, the situation. Adequate accountability and proportional accountability of the platform. So there must be accountability that would avoid not also the lack of not having penalties or preventive censorship. We don't want any of the extremes. And that responsibility has to exist, and it has to exist, especially and being reinforced regarding the boosted and paid content, because we're in the scenario where platforms are being compensated according to the content that's on the platform. And that it was boosted, it was paid for. So someone paid for that content to achieve more people. That also has to be considered as well. I'd also like to reinforce something else. We believe that the responsibility model, accountability model, according to the Internet Civil Milestone, is still valid. It's not unconstitutional, and it doesn't lead to immunity for the platforms. It's not going to make the platform directly liable, requiring a legal decision for that. So the discussion that the STF has had is that that's a main understanding. Article 19 is still valid. It will continue to exist, and it's not unconstitutional. And last, to conclude, it's participative, and aspects and autonomy. So in regulating platforms, the regulation decisions has to be comprised by civil society, specialists, and federal and local governments with technical capacity, autonomy, and democratic legitimacy to implement any measures that will be determined by law, especially regarding content moderation and the practice of these platforms that have been historically obscure. That was my contribution. I'm very happy with the results and the principles that were submitted by the SGI. I believe that we're moving towards a convergence, and I hope that I can contribute towards today's debates. Thank you very much.
Obrigado, Raquel. A gente vai botar na
Thank you,
tela de
Raquel.
novo.
I'm going to put the QR code up on the screen again so you can have access to the consultation of the principles to regulate social media. And now let's move on to Sergio Garcia Alves. He's representing the private sector. He's the manager of public policies in Latin America for the Internet Ally, and he's an attorney, master's in law and technology from UC Berkeley. Hi, Nikki, Raquel, Fernanda, the CGI. Congratulations on organizing this forum. Yesterday, we were already part of day 0 with relevant panels talking about governance, fair share, and other topics that are very important in the public agenda. And Secretary João, congratulations on your work. Raul Tiberier, your colleague from Ally, sends his greetings. Here in the halls of Salvador, they're suggesting to change SECOM to's name to the Secretary of the Commendators. So congratulations. That was a great merit, everything that you have done and your efforts in the international work that you conduct in terms of that agenda. I think it's important to say a few words about Ally. It's an association with specific characteristics. We bring together different companies from different industries, from specific and different origins as well. So companies that were born and established in Brazil, Argentina, China, the US. So we follow these topics in many different countries of the region. The chair, the executives in Brazilian parliament are some of the settings where we have the frequent dialogue. Enrique, in the association, I have to be very transparent regarding this. As we received, and my colleagues as well received the text, we read it, and I'm not sure we're at the point as João and Raquel where they have analyzed the entire table of the principles, but many of them truly adhere with what we have been advocating for in the association during these roundtables and in other works that we've conducted together with Congress. Some of them are very clear, and they do say what we expect from a democratic country and what we expect in terms of the behavior of responsible companies in terms of the services that they offer. So saying that companies have to respect the national laws, such as principle number 1, or that we would work to promote the rights of privacy and freedom of speech. That's something that brings us together as an association. We also have our own principles at the association where we agree in terms of economic development of the region, mechanisms for innovation that will promote an entrepreneurial environment in the entire region to make it more competitive. There are some of these principles, and you've already mentioned as well, and the companies for a review. So I believe that in the next steps of the public consultation, we can still work on the wording, be it in terms of the aspects that probably already offer more guidelines for us, but how that can be operationalized and how we could see that as an inspiration to interpret our training. So the principles of interoperability, such, for instance, portability, and the language that already what we've already talked about before about accountability and systemic risks. So we still don't know what the meaning is yet. That part is a bit harder to read. And if before we were talking about that wording, be it in Congress or in roundtables that João or the executive branch promoted, we don't know about the risks, the clarity, how the accountability system can be used with this type of arrangement. So in some of these principles, I believe that we still need a little more clarity, a little more work. I was going to focus mainly on social media. Secretary João also mentioned other initiatives that could be supplementary to that normative approach. And among them, he mentioned competition or economic regulation. As we don't have access to the full wording, and most of the times we're being informed by the news that is out there. Apparently, we have more than one text being submitted by the executive. So a part of the experience that we had in the previous round with the 2630 bill, the challenge was that we had many topics being addressed at the same time. So the resolution of having separate text would be more efficient, but what we got from that lesson was difficulty in handling too many topics in a simultaneous way in one single arrangement. So I believe that the executive branch, the signaling that they have of splitting up the text might facilitate things, but we still don't know how that will move forward. Within the merit of competition, where there were studies not only about a bill that we have from 2022, PL2768, if I'm not mistaken, and also material from the Ministry of Finance. I'd like to suggest that you read them. Out of that, we know that there's still some difficulty in looking for market failures that are being addressed in the wording of those bills, specifically in the 2768, and the significant contribution that was done in the econometric studies. We highly focused on trying to identify which companies and which platforms that were appointed. So the wording that we've seen so far are very comprehensive and achieve companies that differently than what we can see in Europe. For instance, you have inspiration that led to decision-making in the antitrust subject matter, for instance. Here, what we have in Congress, it's much more comprehensive. So it's achieving 250 platforms of 150 economic groups. So regarding the texts that are for these bills, there's still some parts that need to be fine-tuned. And the one from the Ministry of Finance, having you here with us, Secretary, would be worth noting and hearing from you. One of the aspects that we see that we're interested in is how would the new institutional distribution work in terms of competencies and roles in regulating the economic aspects. That's one of the central matters. So the cost that we've measured for those rates as well, and how much that can be transferred to small companies, new companies, and end users. That seems to us that our legislators would have to consider when implementing any rates or fees or anything equivalent to that. So about, and maybe thinking of another principle now, Enrique and my colleagues here at the panel, we have one for informational self-determination with a very important text and references in data protection in the Brazilian standard. There's a huge challenge, a technological and economic challenge regarding the implementation of solutions and the meaning or the translation of that type of wording into legislative subject matter. So how can we implement or achieve this self-determination objective in the legal subject matter? So converting that into technology solutions and solutions that would recognize that different platforms compete with each other and have different solutions for services. I believe that those are some of the aspects that this public consultation or in the upcoming phases that we reach the president that Ally would like to contribute. So I would like to thank you once more. Thank you, Secretary, for the recognition, and thank you for your words as they give us the opinion of the government regarding this subject matter.
Obrigado, Sérgio. Então vamos
Thank you,
aqui para
Sergio.
nossa próxima panelista.
Our next panelist is Fernanda Campaiuti. She's Executive Director for Internet Lab, and she's been performing for 10 years in this internet regulatory system, and she's got a PhD in public administration. Fernanda, you have the floor. Thank you, Enrique, and good afternoon, everyone. I would like to start by greeting CGI for this amazing initiative, which is to allocate this opportunity for this multi-stakeholder conversation. This is an ongoing work, we all understand, and this is just a starting point. We know how hard it is to define some principles. CGI has worked so hard to reach those 10 principles, but without principles, we have no baseline to start from. So at least we have some starting point from where to go from. Rachel and I, we share the same opinion, and even those who would agree to all those 10 principles may disagree as how that is being addressed. That's why this is a very complex debate, and CGI has suggested this debate, including social media platforms. We are talking about regulatory platform aspects, which is a much broader universe, and what brings us together or not. According to Internet Lab and a survey conducted in partnership with another agency, which is under production, and I have here a summary of what has to do with platform regulations, vectors of disinformation disorder in Latin America. Survey, sampling, discussion groups,
o desenho da pesquisa até
and
análise,
its
que são
several
desses
phases.
grupos. Então, é uma pesquisa muito robusta, né?
That is a
fez,
very
das duas
solid
organizações.
and robust research.
E aqui é uma pequena pincelada que eu vou dar, tá? O
And
spoiler.
here,
Mas uma
just,
coisa
you
importante que essa
know,
pesquisa traz,
some
né, que a gente já pode
spoilers.
começar dizendo, é que existe, sim, no Brasil e no restante da
There
América
is in
Latina,
Brazil
a
and all
percepção de que
over
a gente
Latin
precisa regular
America
a plataforma. Esse é o
a
ponto de
feeling
partida,
that
né?
platforms
Agora, o
they should be
problema, especialmente no
regulated.
Brasil,
But
o
in
Brasil, você entenda que
Brazil,
ele sempre vai
mainly,
destoar da América
Brazil
Latina,
is always different
principalmente porque
from
a gente
other
já
Latin
tem
American countries,
debate
probably because we already
bastante
have a
desenvolvido,
very active and
talvez
ongoing
não
discussion
refinado,
about
mas
that.
bastante presente,
Might
né, no
not
debate
be
sobre
really refined as we would like to, but we have
Quando
a
a gente
very
se
strong
pergunta
presence
três formas
in
de
the
regulação,
public
você
debate.
acha
What are the
que
three ways
as
of
plataformas devem ser
regulatory
reguladas pelas
factors?
próprias
First,
empresas,
platforms they have to
pelo
be regulated
governo
by
ou
their
por
own
lei?
companies, by the
As três
government,
têm
or
uma
by
grande
law.
rejeição,
The
né?
three
A principal
aspects
preocupação, a
they
gente vai
are
ver das
widely
pessoas é a liberdade de
rejected.
expressão.
People they are concerned
Mas,
about
no caso
losing
da lei,
their freedom of
tem um
expression.
reconhecimento de que pela lei
But according
a
to the
rejeição é
law,
menor, né? E a
the
aprovação
rejection
também é maior.
is
Então,
not
tem
so
um ponto aí
significant
que
with a
converge com o que
greater
a gente tem
level
falado,
of
que
approval.
o Congresso é o espaço para esse
The
debate
Congress
ser construído, né? E as
is
pessoas
the
têm
area
essa
where we
percepção.
can build
Mas
up
elas também
such a
parecem
discussion.
confusas, porque esse
But
debate ele
people
também está
are
sendo influenciado pelos
kind
atores
of
que mais têm
mixed
interesse
up because this
em
debate is
fazer,
being
que isso
motivated
não avance,
by
ou que vá
those
devagar.
players
Então, você tem uma
who do not have
confusão aí
any
sendo
interest in
construída
developing
também, né?
these
Então, assim, vou
solutions.
tentar trazer alguns princípios e alguns dados e mesclando isso, né?
I
Não vai dar para falar
will
dos 10,
then
mas tem
share
vários aqui que dialogam bem com a minha
some
pesquisa.
comments or some
Por exemplo,
results
liberdade de
of our
expressão
research
e
that have
direitos
to do with
humanos,
the
né?
10
É uma
principles. For
preocupação
instance,
comum de
human rights
todos
and freedom of expression.
os perfis
This
ouvidos na
is a
pesquisa, né?
concern to
6 em cada
everyone who
10
has been
pessoas da América
interviewed.
Latina
6 out of
acreditam
10
que
people in
quando se
Latin
bloqueia
America,
conteúdo,
they believe that
esse
if you
direito à
block
liberdade de
content,
expressão está sendo
the right
desrespeitado.
to expression is no longer being
30%, né? Quase
respected.
terço das pessoas concordam totalmente com essa
30%,
afirmação.
one third
No
of
Brasil,
the
esse índice é mais
interviewers,
baixo,
they fully
né? No
agree. In
Brasil,
Brazil, that
já se
rate
tem uma
is lower.
compreensão
In Brazil,
que
there is a certain level of
talvez,
understanding
né, o bloqueio de
that
conteúdo
it
seja
might be
necessário, sim,
that
em alguns
content
casos.
block could be necessary
A
in
pesquisa,
few
por ser tão
cases or in
ampla, né, em
some
todos os países da
cases.
América Latina, ela não
As
vai
this is a very
ajudar
broad
a
research
olhar em
in
detalhes, né?
several
Ela está
Latin
olhando para
American
um
countries,
panorama mais
they
geral.
give us an
Então, a gente
overview
não chega tanto nos porquês.
and we don't get
Mas a gente sabe que o
to
debate
the
tem sido
reasons
feito no
why.
noticiário,
But
né?
we know that the
Até
discussion
onde é
is being
bloqueio,
popular,
até onde é uma
is being in the
legítima, né?
news, at what
Liberação.
extent
Então,
is
talvez
this full of
nos nossos
legitimacy or
vizinhos
not?
esse debate tenha sido
Maybe
diferente.
in other Latin American
Por outro
countries,
lado, a gente
that
está falando de
discussion
liberdade de
took a
expressão. O
different
Brasil
direction.
também é
Conversely, we are
o
talking about
país
freedom of
em que mais
expression.
pessoas
And
disseram
Brazil is a
que
country where
deixaram
the greatest
plataformas, redes
majority had
sociais,
mentioned that
por
they
causa de
left
desinformação.
platforms or
Né?
social
Acima
media
da média,
due
aí,
to
28%
disinformation.
disseram que já
38%
deixaram
said
a
that they
plataforma,
no longer
alguma
belong
plataforma por
to
causa
some
disso.
type of a social
Então,
platform because
essa
of that.
a contradição aparente, né? As pessoas
Such a
elas
contradiction
acham que bloqueio de conteúdo
is a way to show that some people they
ataque à
believe
liberdade de
that
expressão, mas
content
elas também
block
abandonam a
is an
plataforma
attack to freedom of
se o
expression, but they
ambiente,
also abandon
né,
the
no
platform
íntegro,
if the environment
mostra que
is
para ter
not
liberdade de
proper.
expressão, né, a
And to
gente só
guarantee
consegue ter
freedom of
liberdade de
expression,
expressão
we can only
em
get
lugares em
freedom of
que os direitos
expression
não são
in
sistematicamente
places where
violados,
rights
né?
they are
Então,
not
existe aí
violated.
caminho também, né?
So there is a
Quem
way
já
to
teve que
follow.
deixar de usar uma plataforma por não se sentir à vontade, sabe
Who has
quanto a
no
liberação
longer
de
used the
conteúdo não é
platform
sinônimo de
for not
censura,
feeling
mas é condição do exercício
comfortable.
pleno da expressão.
This is
Quando
not
as pessoas
censorship,
começam
but is a
a observar isso
exercise
também.
to
Sobre integridade da
allowance.
informação, né?
How
A
about
pesquisa ela mostra que as redes
information
sociais elas
integrity?
se consolidaram como a
According
principal
to the
fonte de
research,
pesquisa. Então,
social
rádio,
media,
TV,
they
jornais
became the main
já
source of
perderam
research. Radio,
protagonismo, né? E as mídias
journals,
se consolidaram
TVs,
como
they are
esse
no longer
intermediário
the
na busca de
most
informação,
popular
na
ones.
recepção, né, de informação.
Citizens, they go after information at different sources. And Brazil is a country where people do not trust information, where we find a greater number of people who says that they trust more their friends, family members, but that they do not trust social platforms. Anything about politics, it's a way to show disinformation, so people suspect of the information. And as to disinformation, the regulation became also an object of disinformation. So again, a symptom that this country is more exposed to that debate, and Brazil is a country where people know the most the so-called expression fake news. People are concerned about freedom of expression, but they don't know ways to deal with that. If they are questioned about mechanisms of alert of fake news, 9 in every 10 people, they believe it's nice. They think it's a way to alert that this news is false or manipulated, and they see that as a best way than exclude content generally. And on a qualitative phase, that's not well known, and people, they come up with the idea to set an alert.
Não existe padrão, né? As plataformas, elas às vezes mudam de dono e retrocedem.
That's not a standard. Platforms, they change their owners, and there is a backlash as how they monitor it.
E por fim, né, outro ponto aqui que é o princípio de prevenção de danos e responsabilidade. Esse é ponto
Prevention
central
to damage and responsibilities. This is a core topic in our debate, as we are talking about a change of paradigm to go from individual approach to a more systemic and preventive one. They all advocate that the main one to be responsible for disinformation is the one that creates content. So they have this more individualized perception. But not only, they show other responsible ones. 1/3 of all people, they say that the company is the information producers, and both the platform and owners, they have to be liable for. And Brazil really relies on the liability to the one that finances disinformation.
De financiamento da desinformação, dos ataques à democracia, né?
And disinformation to attacks to democracy. Despite all this individualization, there is some room for hope. People, they are aware of the use of platforms. 8 in 10 people believe that social media, they benefit from polemic and controversial content. And there is also awareness about algorithm. 8 in 10 people, they believe fully or partially that information is highly influenced by algorithms.
A gente vê, né, nesse conjunto de dados que a gente tem espaço para construir política pública.
So there is room to build up public policies. Integrity, responsibility.
Então tem uma lacuna entre as preocupações legítimas.
There is a gap between legitimacy of their concerns and the understanding they have about all drivers. That's why we have to build up all this understanding, reaching consensus and awareness. People believe that auto-regulation does not work, that has been widely rejected, but they have to see legislative debate as being a way where rules may be built up. They have to feel represented.
A gente vai lançar a pesquisa em breve, né? A gente espera que também contribua para esse processo.
We are going to publish our survey very soon.
A dizer sobre outros princípios, mas a gente pode seguir, né? Principalmente de
But there are
transparência,
some other principles such as interoperability, transparency.
Obrigada.
Thank you.
Obrigado, Fernanda. Acho que é muito importante o resultado da pesquisa.
Thank you, Fernanda.
Nos ajuda bastante nessa discussão hoje aqui do painel.
Your comments were very relevant. Now we have some time for opening to questions, comments. Please, you have to queue to ask your questions. They have to be addressed in the microphone.
Na medida de que houveram 4 falas, que também nesse momento
please address your questions to one of our panelists, please.
Nós já temos aqui uma fila formada. O primeiro a gente vai atender o pessoal que está presencial e eu vou receber.
So we are going to first go to the questions who were addressed on site, and then we are going to get the questions that were submitted via the web. Thank you, everyone. My name is Alexander Guava. I work for MST and in technology, and I am also a peer of Rachel in the Committee of Data Protection, NICE Internet. I'm also part of that program. My comment is, thanks to an initiative called Popular Net, and here I have a technical note of this project, which is a consequence of the popular interest as how to decide upon territory initiatives and interests that the people from these territories have. The importance of a regulation is due not only to social media, but also Tigrinho, children using Linfanzo, which is led into disagreement, hate speech, and a fraud market in the social media. So many people making money being fraudulent. And now my question. To perform a proper regulatory framework that will help the population and diminish the volume of attacks, what is your take on how to perform insertion and what is the role of the territories? Because we don't understand that society is divided between those who studies, those who are entrepreneurs versus those who are in the government versus digital rights access. The society is split. We have those that are suffering, those who are fighting for, and those who are benefiting from. And I would like to leave the technical notes with you, if you allow me. Thank you. We have 4 other people in the queue, so let's get all the questions and then we are going to go for the answers. And please don't exceed 1 minute to address your question. Thank you. My name is Marcel Guerreiro. Good afternoon. I am a lawyer and I work on digital rights, more specifically on consumption's rights, consumers' rights. Congratulations to this panel. This is a very timely and relevant topic.
Sobre aspecto me chamou mais a atenção, eu queria perguntar especificamente ao João.
I would like to ask João.
No que diz respeito, ele citou aí uma questão de que pode vir a ser
about one of his comments. He said that the new internet could be, and the new internet, the OpenAI, could have the same format, similarly to the big text formats, to the operational level. I don't know if you could elaborate a little bit more, please.
Muito obrigado, aos parabéns a todos.
Obrigado.
And congratulations all. So, 2 more questions.
Renata.
Boa tarde. Alô, tá ouvindo?
Hi there.
Tá, beleza. Boa tarde, Renata Miele, representante do MCTI no CGI.
Hello, I am a coordinator of CGI. Congratulations to all panelists. I have a very brief comment followed by a question. First, the CGI's collaborations with this public consultation, it aims to build up a common denominator wherefrom we are gonna enhance not only our proposals, but a number of bills which are being in the national congresses in order to regulate specific topics, but they all should start from minimum basis, from minimum principles. And now my question to Sergio, but it can be to anyone on the panel.
Das plataformas sobre os
How about
conteúdos
platforms liabilities in order to their users' content? And CGI has presented a typology of content providers, and now we would like to set principles. And according to us, social network should be included in our third level of typology, which has an intervention in the content distribution. Therefore, a greater liability should be part of this regulatory aspect, which should reflect some other level of liability. I would like to hear from you. How do you see that debate? What is your understanding? Is it possible to private sectors to acknowledge it? And if you have any other ideas or suggestions as how this responsibility could take place, especially those platforms with a high users intervention. Thank you.
So let's hear one more question. We'll have 4, so we have a lot to discuss. Go ahead, please. Hi, everyone. I'm Rihanna. I'm from IPREC. Good afternoon. I would like to thank all the panelists for their talks. So my question is about a discussion we had yesterday about encryption. So we feel that with the death of the Bill of Law for fake news in Congress, that the participation of children and teenagers have really impacted them in Brazil. So how do we talk about regulation of social media without going into problems like mass monitoring or even going to encryption? Everybody agrees that it's important to protect children and teenagers, but these questions also have to be asked because, first of all, it's a very sensitive matter that usually mobilizes players from different political aspects, different than the topic that's freedom of speech that usually divides society. And second, because that permeates the discussion of the fake news bill of law, and some of these devices fell. And also, we see an international movement about that in the United Kingdom and the Safety Act in the US, and they influence the discussions that we have here in Brazil. Thank you, everyone. Okay. I'm going to repeat a question that was online for panelists. Aline Rocha asks if the elderly couldn't be included as a vulnerable group with children and teenagers. I'd start off by saying that João was already mentioned. He was the first to speak. And so first to João and then to the others to answer the questions for each one of them specifically, as well as general considerations about the questions. Thank you, Enrique. How much time do I have so I don't get lost? 3 minutes. Okay. I'm going to steal another 4. Okay. Let's see. First of all, in dialoguing with Alexander, there's a very important question that comes up that gives us a vision that I share, which is, in my point of view, is not understanding regulation as an isolated action from public policies and incentives that you could have for a digital environment that's more democratic and more capable of producing what's right. So, and that specifically about regulation, obviously there are aspects that have to look into the topics that you mentioned. So how do we handle hypersegmentation risks in the public debate that would lead to the fact that you wouldn't have a connection between conversations of peripheral sectors with other sectors that have a more concentrated power. So we can talk a lot about risks, but risks are based on the logic of protecting fundamental rights. So that's not the main answer for your question. So it's about recognizing the powers that we already have and recognizing those peripheral players and the territories and using territories as an understanding of the different types of Brazils we have in the country and of what can actually take off. So yesterday, the launch of the solutions incubator for medias that are from the peripheral area, Black and independent, is part of the vision about how we should drive everything and working on that based on tools and instruments that many times aren't available for small initiatives, but should be and could gain momentum if they were supported by an institution. So Marcel asked about OpenAI, and I see OpenAI movement as a way to generate more engagement by users, so spending more time on the platform and interacting with content, so knowing not only what they demand, but how they react to certain content. And that means greater capacity of profiling and therefore commercial exploration of that data. So I don't see that in a good way, because if that is taken to the last power, we'll see the same problems that we see in social media. But it's natural that OpenAI would pursue that path. It seems that one of the challenges of regulation is having antidotes so that we can circle the options in the business model. And Renato's question, I think, is mainly for Ally. I believe that the position of the government and responsibility is clear. So I'll talk to Rayane about compatibilize regulation and avoid the mass aspects. I think there's many layers to that question. If we look at Discord, there's a problem there in having servers, large servers in which you have illegal practices, be it to encourage suicide or self-mutilation or encourage animal torture, all of that without any supervision or monitoring. So the videos, the live videos and chats are not subject, at least in Discord, to any type of monitoring. And that is a problem. You can't handle that situation in a natural manner. So there's that thing about the user privacy, and at the same time, this kind of practice being constantly documented on that platform is a problem. And I believe that part of the solution is in AI, in the capability of the system being able to identify that in the case of identifying clearly illegal practices. And I'm sure that AI is already able to identify that type of content is breaking privacy and having some sort of level of supervision to see what's happening. So they've been doing that through infiltration and other mechanisms that are not positive, in my opinion, to preserve privacy. So I believe that using AI might give us answers that will allow for a balance in protecting the different kinds of rights. Thank you. Renata, thank you for your question. And responsibility is one of the most interesting topics here in this aspect of principles. So the structure and the research that you had about the topology and typology of the network or of the web was very rich, but we still have to understand the details a little more. Even though Ally isn't part of the process specifically that's being discussed in the Supreme Court, in the association, one of the drivers of the growth of internet is the non-accountability of the intermediaries, and that's based on Article 19 in the Constitution, and that's something that still brings us together as an association. However, there are situations in platforms, and each one is designed in a different way with different patches and terms of service different, practices different, that are different, and models that are different. We're able to distinguish situations in which a case in which a platform isn't acting as an intermediary, that's clear and more evident. At least you may be able to envision a situation of liability, but that would have to be very clear, in which you have a number of interventions or something that's stronger to have a connection to the damage that's caused. So if it's an intermediary company, it wouldn't be liable, but if it's not, and if they're not complying with court orders or if there's negligence, then the format changes a lot.
Vamos passar para Raquel. Raquel, responder parte das perguntas ou alguma pergunta específica?
So, is there any other specific questions here? Thank you for your questions. So, first of all, answering Ale about the role of territories.
Esse tema historicamente, né, governança da internet, mas esse tema de regulação de plataformas que a gente vem tratando aqui é um tema muito nichado.
So the regulation of platforms that we've been talking about here is a niche area. There's the presence of specialists in this topic, but what's missing is a dissemination of this discussion beyond the frontiers of digital. So the perspective of territories is valid and very much necessary. So we have to be able to reach people that are not specialists in the topic in a clearer way, in a more get to them and explain what's happening, because that affects everyone in different ways, but it affects everyone. And I believe that it's very necessary to pursue alternatives of platforms that are more open and more inclusive, that don't fall into services of major technology companies that have that business model that's predatory for personal data, that make money based on hate speech and so on and so forth. So we have to think of alternatives for that. And about Rayana's question about the protection of children and teenagers, that comes up every now and then in the debate in regulating platforms, because we're always looking to justify the regulation. There was a time when it was terrorism or criminal organizations, and then after that it was disinformation, and now it's the protection of children and teenagers. So about that, I'd like to stress the IPREX positioning and thank Ran about the question and opportunity opportunity to talk about this is that this regulation has to understand the technical limits of technologies. So in the case of encryption, and that's something that we've been defending a lot, is that no legislative department can break encryption because encryption is there to protect us, to protect rights such as freedom of speech, privacy of personal data, even for children and teenagers. So we've been working with that perspective. And the IPREC has some publications in that sense that encryption should be preserved. And these solutions, legislative solutions that point to mass surveillance should be avoided as much as possible. And about the last question about the elderly being included with children and teenagers as vulnerable persons, I agree. We do forget the elderly, and they have some difficulty in using technology, and we have to treat that as well. So they are a vulnerable audience together with children and teenagers, and most of the measures that for safety, in terms of safety and security for children and teenagers are also valid for the elderly. Thank you.
Bom, acho que eu concordo bastante com a Raquel, então não vou
I
repetir
agree
alguns
with
pontos,
Raquel,
mas
so I'm not going to
dado de
repeat
contexto
much of what
também
she
que eu queria
said,
trazer pra
but just to
essa
give you
situação,
some context for the situation.
algumas semanas foi lançado
Some
o Índice Nacional
weeks,
de
there
Alfabetismo
was weeks
Funcional,
ago,
né?
we had the
Que mede a
National
capacidade das pessoas
Index of
de letramento, de
Literacy,
compreenderem as coisas.
and that
E pela
measures how
primeira vez
people
foi
can
medida a
understand and read
capacidade
things. And
de
for the
lidar com
first time, they
tecnologias. Então, teve uma
measured
prova digital
the
também.
literacy in
E aí
technology. They had a digital
alarmante
test
mesmo,
as
porque
well.
não
So it's really
só os
alarming.
índices são
Not
persistentes
only
no
are
alfabetismo funcional no
the
Brasil, quanto
functional
mesmo quem é
illiteracy
considerado
rates
letrado também tem
alarming,
nível
even
de
people that are
analfabetismo
considered
funcional em
literate,
tecnologia.
they also have a
Essas
functional
pessoas
illiteracy
são muito
aspect
afetadas, são
in
desproporcionalmente afetadas,
technology.
elas são
So
mais
they're
afetadas do
disproportionately
que as
affected. They're
outras, né?
more affected than others.
Então, é preciso
Even
sim lidar
so, yes, we do have
com a
to
difusão, né, desse
handle
debate, porque essas pessoas elas precisam participar,
lead
entender
and deal
que a
with
pesquisa
the
que a gente fez
dissemination of this
mostra
debate,
que
because these people
elas
have to
entendem
understand that
que
based on the
tem
research that we
não com esse
conducted,
nome, não é um modelo de negócios, mas elas
I wouldn't
entendem
say
que os
it's a business.
mecanismos estão lá, né?
So
A
the
gente precisa
elements are
avançar,
there, and we have to
construir tecnologias
advance,
também. A gente,
build
quando a gente fala de
technologies
regulação
as
de
well.
plataforma,
When we
nesse
talk
debate, a
about
gente acaba
regulating the
focando muito em
platform in this
apagar
debate, we're
incêndio,
focusing a
em
lot
reduzir
on putting
danos,
out
em mitigar
fires
danos,
and
mas a regulação
mitigating
ela também pode
damage
servir
and
para
harm.
apontar para os
But
caminhos de
regulation could
construção de
also be
tecnologias que
good
a gente
to
quer,
point out
né?
the
Apontar
paths
para
for building
visões do que é a
technologies that we
tecnologia que a
want
gente quer.
and
Então,
visions
a
of the type of
interoperabilidade, por
technology that
exemplo, que
we
é um dos
want. So the
princípios, ela
interoperability,
faz
that's
com
one
que
of the
as pessoas
principles,
possam falar assim, eu
enables
não
people
estou
to say,
satisfeita com essa
I'm not
plataforma, e
satisfied with
migrar
this
para outra
platform,
sem
and
o
move to
custo de perder os
another one
amigos, de
without the
perder o
cost of
contato com a
losing their
família,
friends
é um
or
custo muito alto.
contact with their family, because that's a
Então,
very high
esses
cost.
mecanismos da
So
regulação, eles
these
também podem
mechanisms
servir
and
para
regulation
incentivar
can
outras
also be valid to
tecnologias
encourage other
populares, tecnologias
technologies,
que são
popular
construídas pelas
mainstream technologies that
comunidades,
are built by
para que não
communities,
fiquem refém também
so
dos
that they're
jardins
not at
dourados
the
das big techs,
mercy
né?
of the
Obrigado. Então vamos
walls
para
of the
mais
big
um bloco de
techs.
perguntas aí.
Let's move on to
Se
another block of
se
questions.
apresente e faça a sua
And
pergunta.
please
Nossa
introduce
pergunta.
yourself and ask your question up to 2 minutes.
Obrigado, antes
Thank
de
you.
mais nada,
Thank you.
agradecer o espaço.
First of all,
Uma
I'd like
importante iniciativa
to
poder estar
thank you for
participando
creating
aqui
this
desse debate
space.
para
It's a great
recuperar a
initiative to be a part
agenda
of this
em torno
debate to
da
recover
reativação das
the
plataformas
agenda
digitais depois do que
regarding
aconteceu
the
nos últimos anos
regulation
no
of digital
Brasil.
platforms after everything that's
E
happened in the past
eu
years in Brazil.
tenho basicamente dois comentários que eu gostaria de
Basically, I have
colocar
two
em
comments
relação à
that I
discussão
would
que está
like to
acontecendo aqui.
mention about this
A
discussion we're
o
having
primeiro
right now.
comentário
The first
vai numa
comment
linha de reforçar elemento que meu
is in
xará,
terms
o
of
outro Alexandre,
reinforcing an
trouxe
element that
em
the other
referência, que
Alexander mentioned,
precisamente esse esforço e de construção
which is
da
the
campanha
effort
internet legal,
in
enquanto
building the
a
Internet
formação de campo de
Legal or
organizações do
Cool
direito
Internet
digital, de movimentos sociais envolvidos na
campaign.
luta
So the digital
pelo
movements,
direito
social
ao
movements
trabalho, à
that are
terra,
involved
ao
in the
meio
right
ambiente, à
to
defesa da
work,
saúde e
land,
outras áreas
environment, advocating for health and other areas to develop and this discussion because it affects everybody's life. And the other comment in general terms is about a second element that was mainly shown in Fernanda's talk at first, and then she mentioned it again, which is the perception that when you're talking about the regulation of these platforms and companies, we move from the responsibility of an user, but actually the structural responsibility that these companies have in organizing and structuring social relationships. So that, in a way, is present in some of the principles that will be built after the consultation, which is that a segment in industry will have a symmetry to discuss that. And what happened to the Bill 2630 in 2023 and 2024 shows that the structural and other regions have to not only the social aspects of their family and friends, but also work. So Meta paid for a project that it should attack disinformation, but actually it would attack Joe's Bakery. And then YouTube issued a notification for a comprehensive sector of digital influencers to create insecurity towards this discussion, saying that this type of regulation would affect the conditions that these people could work and exist and survive. So that's my comment. And it's important to recognize that there are players that are at an advantage in this, and that working towards the regulatory framework is the first step, and to move forward these principles could lead to create policies that would enable us to build alternatives. And finally, visit internetlegal.com.org.br, where we suggest that other organizations could be enrolled and be a part of these groups. Thank you. I'm Elizabeth. And my question is for Sergio Cabral. And after to the two participants, Sergio. First of all, I think it's great to see Ally here, see you here, discussing and debating, saying that there's a proposal and that you're going to focus on that. Because in practice, corroborating with Alexander just mentioned, and I'm from Congress and I militate for many years, they're not part of the debates. And in last case, they're still there and actually played a star role of the campaign. Google launched in their blog that PL 2630 is going to end internet as we know it. They won millions with the campaign. So we know that big techs don't want to discuss it. They don't want regulation. And after Trump was elected, there was an announcement, and they suffer with disinformation, and countries that have higher regulation, they suffer less with damaging behavior towards big techs and lack of responsibility. So will Ally discuss that? Because you don't need the CGI or Congress. All they have to do is go to the president of the House of Representatives and say that we have a project, we don't have to wait for an amazing project. So it's an ambiguous discourse, participation and non-participating. So it's eloquent, and the defense of self-regulation was always done, and we know that it's insufficient. So I'd like to hear from Ally if you defend self-regulation, or if you believe that based on all that scenario, you need internet survey that's light, unmistaken, because Brazil is lack of information and social media is to blame. So I just finished my PhD, and that's why I'm saying that. And for the girls, I'd like to have a question for you. I'm from the Disconnect movement. I think social media is very damaging, and we need to take kids away from it. There's no other measure. And all the resistance that we have from platforms to act in a way that's really responsible. So the Disconnect movement, I'd invite everybody to visit that website. So up to 14 years of age, don't give them a smartphone or internet, and up to 16, no social media. Is that extreme? Yes, it is. But people are dying because of social media. Thank you, everyone. Sorry for speaking so fast, but it's a unique moment to be able to talk to Ally at this time and have the answers, assertive answers. Thank you. Do we still have time?
Obrigado pela excelente sessão. Eu sou o Winston, pesquisador do CETIC. Vou ser muito breve. Eu queria trazer dois pontos
Next,
adicionais.
I would like to add two additional comments, such as among the childhood age range, if you could elaborate a little bit more. And how about information integrity? We see that there is a concern about manipulative design platforms. These are the two comments that I would like you guys to elaborate, please. Hello, my name is Maria de Maciel. I am a digital commerce director and also issues on privacy and security. My question is to João, but I'd like to thank you all for your time. And João, you mentioned about a governance position and how they perform. Sometimes it's difficult to clearly understand what their position is. And there are two disconnected measures. On one side, on one hand, there is a recent approval by the government regarding data governance over the BRIC countries, and I know that Brazil was widely involved addressing data sovereignty and DPIs. On the other hand, we had Haddad, the minister, visiting a number of technological sites. And what is the relationship between them? Hyperscanners, they are also platform. Amazon, Google, they are all platforms, and that will influence the content we are here discussing. Conversely, the American government have decreed an executive order, a measure regarding technology, information, and services. Now the American government is able to approve restricted measures, technology flow, AI models, semiconductors, that could be put into practical terms anytime, as if the United States would be on a war state, and they believe so. Recently, President Trump has approved another executive measure which goes against the International Criminal Court due to a number of investigations that the court is producing at Gaza area. And technology companies such as Microsoft cannot offer services to the international court. The court right now is without email, without any chance to perform internal communication, because all services went down and Microsoft does not want to suffer secondary sanctions. And all others from the civil society that were offering data and information to the courts, they're afraid to communicate with them, because just by sending an email would be a way to show that they are not complying with the sanctions, and they would be violating it. How may we regulate platforms if we are internally under a very vulnerable position? And if the American government decides to do something against our government, and then what? We are going to suspend offering this technology to Brazil if we see ourselves dependent on this infrastructure. How are we going to behave? We know that Haddad is the minister's project are not yet clear. But if you could mention, how does this internal position happens? How is the government getting coordinated? They seem to be disconnected one from another, but they are not. And after the break, we are going to have a talk about sovereignty, and you are all invited to participate. Thank you. Hi there, my name is João. I am from CGI Youth Program. PL 2630, which is a massive campaign about the big techs or against them. How does the civil society and the academy foresee this relationship between the Congress and some other players? I understand that this will require really deep discussion. And how about the non-regulation of big techs, or how can we balance all the interests to guarantee that the government PL will be approved and that in Brazil there is a scenario where social media platforms must be regulated, taking that into account, and to avoid things like the PL 2630. We still have 20 minutes to go, so each one of the participants will have 4 minutes to answer to any of the questions and also to make your closing remarks. João, you are the first one. Thank you, Henrique, and thank you for all questions addressed. I did not greet properly my dear panelists. It is a great honor to hear to you. Better later than even later, isn't it?
Eu queria, na verdade, trabalhar, talvez, as perguntas do Winston, da Marília e do
I think
João.
I would like to answer Winston's, Marília, and João's questions. I'll try to summarize some and to go more into details about one of the questions. Age range is a relevant topic. The Justice Ministry has just organized a working group to understand effective mechanisms to check age ranges, where we'll be able to use a format not only by companies in terms of use, but also in their regulatory process, where they all could be effective. Otherwise, while we are pretending that children don't use social media, and we know that that's not true, it's not going to work. I also understand that the private sector is collaborating to that debate. As to design,
boa parte do que a gente está enxergando aqui como efeitos negativos das redes sociais.
Most of what we understand as being negative social media effects, they have to do with the design where they want to maximize engagement.
Da Frances Haugen.
I remember Frances Haugen, former Facebook's employee, when she left, and she recommended what perspectives should be corrected. And then she shared some tricks, some changes which are not huge without affecting considerably our business model, will have a very important effect on rights protections. I agree with her observation. That's why an assessment based on systemic systemic risks, which is permanent and interactive to platforms, it has to work better. Talking to the Congress is somewhat fundamental. Today, we have manifestations by the Republican leaders saying that the regulatory aspects is not a topic to be discussed by the government, anticipating a position without discussing any merit or anything to the text. Well, we have to understand that we don't have a trivial setting in the Congress, but we have to change a little bit. The Supreme Court decision may generate that.
Pressão de pais, famílias.
Peer pressure.
Eu acho que dar visibilidade.
And to give visibility to the evidences, such as fraud and coup, that is key, and it affects all for Brazilian families. And last, Marília's position about unified governmental position. Well, Marília, more than anybody else, I reinforce your perception. That is not easy. And about that, I'm talking about the digital umbrella. There is no dedicated ministries. We have 15 altogether with different priorities. And if there isn't anything which is mandatory, such as a bill, you are not going to have a common position. The government is a galaxy and not just a solar system. So in case of digital services and it was able to get to a final conclusion.
Esforços internos. E acho que esse tema que você traz dos data centers e
data centers,
de como é que se materializa a discussão de
soberania, and how may we materialize digital sovereignty
de regras e de políticas
on an environment of public policies. That is central in the government. Data centers, policies, somehow it starts from the idea that you have to have in the country an installed capacity of processes to be able to develop a national industry, which has to be related to deliveries to the national industry. Otherwise, you are going to have data centers in your countries just working with international audience, and some facilitators are key to guarantee some sort of sovereignty. You cannot have a mechanism which in practical terms will favor the presence of international companies, and it will harm those that will have a greater capacity to compete with them. And that's not an easy equation. It has to be discussed case by case. It's a shame that we cannot, greet just one of them. I thank you for the invitation, the possibility to be here today. I apologize for not being here, and I wish you all the best.
Obrigado, Henrique.
Thank you, Henrique.
Mais de uma vez aqui a gente foi citado a tramitação do PL 2630.
The PL 2630 has been mentioned here.
Eu participei, assim como muitos de vocês aqui daquele.
Like many of you, I was part of that.
Que ninguém quer ter de novo. Assim, não tem, apesar de não tivemos uma legislação, projeto.
We didn't have a legislation, a process that advanced, but anything that was in that trament was of good results.
Durante tempo se esforçar e reatar.
Everyone had to reinforce to get closer the communication channels. I hope that does not come up to happen in the future.
Beth, eu queria endereçar algumas das suas. Obrigado pela sua pergunta sobre o nível de participação da ALAI no Congresso. Mas nós estivemos algumas vezes em momentos muito perto de
We were
fechar
very close to close that text, which is an analysis and assessment of our association.
Extremamente complexo também que o relator Orlando tocava. A redação esteve muito perto ali, mas à medida que foram novos textos, aquela idas e vindas de redação,
the text, when was not ready at once, it went and come, and I think that's why we couldn't be able to close it right away. I cannot say specifically about each technology company that is part of ALI, but I usually meet my friends at the congresses in the weekday. I was participating on a public hearing introducing ALI about regulatory economic regulations under Ani Ortiz deputy. We still have another number of audiences here about governance, FAST-A, and several others.
Verdade também é que a agenda de tecnologia é muito ampla.
The technology agenda is broad. 7 ministries to close a text. So in some situations, we won't be able to be present everywhere. But there is a monitoring. And in addition, our association, which is a regional one, and that is a commitment of the association with everyone in the region. We have Pablo, who is in Colombia, and he collaborates to civil society, private sector, in the Caribbean, Latin America, Mexico.
Isso a gente se divide esforço.
And then we have shared efforts to be able to meet the whole demands. And congratulations for your PhD. I know how hard that must be. I know that Beth in the Congress is responsible for a communication channel with valuable interviews. And congratulations to all your efforts.
Espero que eles também ali.
I hope that they can also find some room for collaboration.
Tenho que falar aqui também em nome do senhor, porque eu também sou.
On behalf of Professor Glaser, I see youths now. I was a younger myself in the past, and I cannot thank you enough, CGI. Thank you.
Obrigado, Sérgio. Então, Raquel.
Thank you, Sergio. Now, Rachel.
Eu queria responder as duas perguntas que vieram sobre proteção.
I would like to answer the two questions addressing children's and adolescents protection.
Mas no ano passado, o IPREC publicou uma pesquisa chamada Termômetro do Acesso Adequado à Idade.
A survey called the Thermometer of the Proper Age Access.
E no Brasil. E conduziu uma série de entrevistas com especialistas.
With a number of surveys with experts.
Com o objetivo de fornecer algumas diretrizes de como
and the
criança e
goal was
adolescente
to
podem
allow
estar
some
inseridos em
guidelines as how
plataformas
children
digitais,
and adolescents
com a
may
segurança
navigate freely and safely
prevista
in
né?
those.
E aí, dentro dessa pesquisa, a gente criou 3 macro
And
categorias.
in that survey, we created 3 macro categories. So design focused on children and adolescents, ethics, privacy, and security, and digital literacy. So in the first category, we created 3 subcategories. So the first one, children and teenager at the core to guide them, and people in their protection system, and in the development process of digital products, listening to the demands that children and teenager require. Second category is design according to age, to see how digital products and services could adapt considering the development and progressive autonomy of that audience. And lastly, in that category, we establish the economy of attention and manipulatory design, where we signal the need that services and digital platforms should not adapt manipulation practices, manipulation of their behavior, and consider ways to mitigate screen time as well. So that's very rich material that we offer to the audience to help in that debate in protecting children and teenagers in the digital environment. I'd like to conclude with that and thank you for the invitation again. The IPREC is at your disposal. We have a lot of work available for the audience on the website. And feel free to reach out. We'll be here during the entire week. Thank you.
Obrigado. Obrigado,
Thank
Raquel.
you. Thank you, Raquel.
Eu tô achando muito fácil ficar depois da Raquel.
It's very easy to sit right after her because she already mentions a lot. So I was thinking about how I could say something without sounding too odd, right? Because we only talk about problems. It feels like we don't like the internet, but actually everybody that's at the FIB is here because they love the internet. And you probably, since you were very young, loved technology and saw the potential of how that could transform lives and the potential of building a reality. So I'm saying that because when we talk about children and teenagers, we can't hinder them from being a part of that world and that ability of also building that world and understand what's going on in that world. The internet is no longer a place where you transport yourself into. We're already connected, fortunately. So without a doubt, there's a discussion about decreasing screen time, but how do we bring together all these needs to protect with the need to develop the autonomy and the full citizenship in the digital environment? Because it's an extra setting, not just a separate one. So about creating a public sphere, digital sphere for everyone means to do the things that Raquel mentioned. So think about the design of the framework and applications focused on people and thinking of children's needs. So that's one of the takeaways. Remind everyone that we love the internet and we're only doing all of that because we believe it could be different. And another point is that everything that we've discussed here today means that we're running a big risk of not understanding what happening in platforms because of the restriction to access to data. We're having a shutdown of data in the platform. So it's really hard for us to understand what's going on in this environment. So you may have seen that some APIs have been closed, the mechanisms to connect to platforms to have access to data for research and connecting them to other applications. And an example of that is that a week ago, we launched Monitora, that's an observatory of online violence based on gender that looked at the elections. And in that edition, and based on the last elections, we couldn't see some of the platforms because you no longer have access to data. So it really reduced our capacity to understand how violence is happening, how disinformation is disseminating. So the agenda cannot happen. It will not develop if we don't have a very serious debate in regulations. And that's one of the principles that CGU also has regarding transparency of platforms. Not just about that, about what's going on and the content and being able to study and analyze, but also what's going on in their operation, the structure that they have for moderation, for each language,
as quantidades de conteúdo que estão sendo moderados ou
the
não,
quantity
enfim, tudo
of
isso é objeto de
content that's being
transparência.
monitored or not. So all of that is an object of transparency. So we have to advance in the development of the transparency parameters in the conversation about regulation. That's the only way that we will truly understand what's happening and propose more effective and adequate measures. So that's what I had to say. Thank you for the invitation. We are available to move forward with this conversation here at the FIB.
Obrigado, Fernanda. Quero agradecer muitíssimo.
Thank you, Fernanda. I would like to thank all our speakers. They gave us very important insights about this conversation that we have about regulating platforms, and also thank the audience and everyone who participate, and encourage everyone to answer and collaborate with our public consultation. And I hope that this advances and that we have an internet that we already love that could be even better according to what we need. Thank you, everyone.